Thursday's election results caused a political earthquake in England, with Nigel Farage's Reform taking control of 10 county councils, 2 mayoralties and 1 extra MP. And the press is now full of speculation that Nigel Farage could be the next Prime Minister. In The Telegraph, Alison Pearson claimed that a new dawn had broken and that Farage might just be our next Prime Minister. For the BBC, Laura Koonsberg said the election proved Farage's ambitions to lead the country were not a wild notion. And even Kemi Badenoch has admitted that her rival in Reform could get the job she so covets. So are they right? Well, earlier today, I caught up with elections guru, Professor John Curtice.
There's another 4 years to go between now and the next general election. And one should be very, very wary about trying to anticipate the outcome of a general election on the back of local elections just 1 year in to a current parliament. I mean, anybody who has any memory of what happened in the last parliament should be extremely wary about assuming that things are going to stay constant. After all, in the last parliament, the Conservatives were dominant in the polls and in local elections in the first 2 years of that parliament, and then along came Partygate, and the rest is history. More broadly, I mean, I would say clearly, there is a possibility that Reform could well be significant players in the next election. Essentially, the foundation of their position and what they achieved on Thursday is essentially to take away from the Conservatives what we might call the pro-Brexit Johnsonian coalition. The Reform success is very heavily concentrated amongst people who voted for Brexit, who would still vote for Brexit in areas where Brexit was relatively popular back in 2016. Now, that's not just an indication of people's attitudes towards the European Union. It's part of a broader mindset, because people who are in favour of Brexit tend to be more concerned about immigration. They tend to be less liberal on issues of transgender. They are the people who think that we are denigrating our past and our imperial past and our empire, et cetera, far too much. It's a very, very clear, distinct outlook. It was the section of our society that swung in behind Boris Johnson in 2019. Reform took a lot of it away back in last summer, and they've now pretty much, I think, taken pretty much all of it. It's not, in these local elections at least, the Conservatives are no more successful in the strongest pro-Leave areas as they are in the most pro-Remain areas. But beyond that, I mean, the issue is twofold. One is the question of parliamentary arithmetic. In other words, is it clear that at the moment that Reform can get to 326? Well, not necessarily. Bear in mind, they only just got about 30% of the vote in these elections. The second is, would they be in a position to do a deal with anybody, to get them in a position where they might be able to take them over the line? All of that is deeply, deeply uncertain.
And so obviously, I mean, something going on at these elections was Reform trying to overtake the Tories as the sort of main right-wing party, and I suppose what usually is a two-party system. Labour also had a bad night. To what extent are those two connected? Were Labour losing votes to Reform, or was this basically Labour losing votes to people to their left?
Well, the evidence both of the polling and of the local elections is that the Reform are primarily taking votes off the Conservatives. And of course, the baseline for Thursday's elections was May 2021. And we know that between then and last year's general election, Reform took almost wholly voters off the Conservatives. But you can still see where Reform do best, it's the Conservatives who particularly suffer. It is not Labour who particularly suffer. Okay. That said, Reform ended up, in terms of share of the vote, doing as well in Labour-held wards as they did in Conservative-held wards, because there are sufficient people who voted Conservative in 2021 in those wards to take Reform a long way there. Plus, the other thing we do know from opinion polls is that Labour is now indeed losing some support to Reform. But actually, would that Labour's problems were that simple? The opinion polls suggest, and again, you can look at the local elections and find other evidence of this, is that Labour's problem is that their vote's going all over the place. So basically, if you take the opinion polls from just before the local elections, of those people who voted Labour in 2024, 9% have gone to reform. That's much bigger figure than last summer, but it is only 9%. 9% are going to the Liberal Democrats. 8% were going to the Greens, and even the Conservatives were making net gains from Labour. So Labour's problem is that its coalition is fracturing in different directions. We certainly know that amongst younger people, the Greens inflicted quite considerable damage amongst Labour last summer, and certainly where the Greens do particularly well in these local elections, and of course there's not a great deal of variation in their performance, but where they did do relatively well, it is indeed Labour and the Liberal Democrats who primarily suffer, and not the Conservatives. So broadly speaking, we do now have a two-block system in Britain. So we don't have a two-party system anymore, but we have a two-block system. There's a lot of interchange between the Conservatives and Reform. There's a lot of interchange between Labour, the Liberal Democrats, and the Greens. But the party that is most in the middle of these two blocks, the centre party of British politics, is Labour, and therefore Labour are at risk of losing votes in both directions.
You can also phrase that in a positive way, which is that Labour are the only ones who can unite the two sides if they have a particular policy platform which can do it. And I suppose that gets on to how Labour should respond. Obviously, big debates within the Labour Party, which involve people's sort of political persuasions and their sort of ethical commitments. But from you as a pollster, what do you make of the various positions being put forward? So obviously, there are some people close to Keir Starmer who seem to want him to go further to the right on migration to try and meet reform in the middle and peel some of their voters off. Other people on the left who are saying now is the time to properly do economic populism because you're never going to beat reform at their own game. From the perspective of someone sort of looking at the numbers and the polling, which of those do you think has more, I suppose, credibility?
The answer already follows from what I said is neither. Let me tell you one other crucial feature of the local election results. Where did Labour's vote fall most? By a very substantial amount. Answer, the wards that Labour were trying to defend. In fact, the electoral system worked against Labour in exactly the same way as it worked against the Conservatives. But that isn't just an electoral system point. Partly it's arithmetically inevitable, but it also suggests that where are Labour losing ground most? In its heartlands. And in fact, some of the recent multiple regression and post-stratification polling also suggests that Labour's fall in support since last summer is in the areas where it's strongest. And I would say to you, the fact that Labour are even having the debate about what to do in these terms just reveals a fundamental weakness of Labour's appeal really over the last few years. It's constantly thinking about how it should position itself in order to defeat its opponents. It is not thinking about how to best position itself in order to define itself for the electorate and to be clear about what it's about. And I would argue that the fundamental problem that Labour have is they went into government without a clear narrative or story about what they're about. Voters and did not embrace. Labour only got 35% of the vote. Ignore that parliamentary majority. It is very, very misleading. Labour came out of the 2024 election skating on very thin ice, and the ice is just simply melted, perhaps even more quickly than some of us anticipated. And then what's happened is that because people don't have a vision of what this government's about, and then they hear that winter fuel allowance is going down and benefits and welfare is being cut, they kind of go, well, we thought that the one thing we did know about the Labour Party is that it wanted to look after people who are relatively badly off. And apparently this government is not even in favour of that. That's why those issues end up having resonance. The fundamental, so my answer to is not to try to tack left or to tack right, but to march ahead to the drumbeat of a sound that you yourself create. Because unless Labour define what this government is about, it is always at risk of other people defining it for themselves and their opponents defining it for themselves. And therefore, Labour will always be vulnerable.
And the deputy leader of the Greens has today launched a challenge to the co-leaders of the Green Party. So Zach Polanski is standing against Carla Denyer and Adrian Ramsey. Now, I'm not going to ask you about the sort of internal workings of the Green Party, but Zach's argument, is that the Greens have somewhat underperformed recently, because if you look at what's going on the right, you've got this sort of right-wing populism of Nigel Farage, which has been incredibly successful and has managed to tap into the anger of the general public and challenge the Conservatives as one of the two main parties. Whereas the Greens, I mean, they're doing better than they have, but it's sort of 1 or 2 points better as opposed to a breakout moment. When you look at the Greens, do you think that as it stands, they have been underperforming?
I mean, it depends on how you want to look at it. I mean, I think one has to say, first of all, that 9% in the opinion polls is an equal record, which is their current average, is an equal record high. And it matches what they got in the immediate wake of the 1989 European elections, when they did dramatically well and came third, and that stage caused quite an earthquake. It helped to lead to some of Margaret Thatcher's statements about needing to deal with the Green agenda thereafter. And there was a very brief period when, even in polling for Westminster, they were at 9%. That's where they're at now. That said, well, I was saying on Friday, yeah, I think it's fair to say that as compared with recent local election performance, because the Greens have made incremental progress in local elections in recent years. They do now tend to do better in local elections than in national elections, and they've also succeeded in start to be able to turn local elections into parliamentary success with some of their successes last year. But it's certainly fair to say that they are not having the same and while they're certainly having some success at eroding Labour and profiting from Labour's unpopularity, they're not having the same degree of success at Reform or having the Conservatives. Now, of course, part of the problem is that there's also the competition for Liberal Democrats, right? But particularly insofar as what at the end defines Reform is their socially conservative agenda. What certainly defines the Greens at least as much as anything else is their socially liberal agenda, but the Liberal Democrats also occupy that space as well. So to that extent, at least, there is more competition for, as it were, the progressive voter than there is elsewhere. So I think it's a fair comment, but A, don't underestimate what has been achieved. But be sure, is there more opportunity out there? Perhaps.
And in terms of how they do that, is there space for a sort of economic populism of the left that you think could do well with this electorate? Obviously, the Labour Party, seem quite centrist when it comes to the economy. The Lib Dems, obviously very centrist when it comes to the economy. Could the Greens carve out a more economically populist space and maybe make waves, sort of really create some momentum behind them? Do you think that's plausible?
Certainly the challenge to all of our political parties is to be able to articulate and channel the deep economic pessimism in our society and the deep concern about the state of our public services. Nigel Farage does that brilliantly, and therefore, as a result, is able to win over the support of the corner of the market we have been talking about. That said, it does have to be borne in mind, and this in the end is a real constraint. We basically maxed out our credit card during the pandemic and in the wake of the Russian-Ukraine war. So there is relatively little room for maneuver so far as increasing public spending is concerned, certainly increasing public spending without also increasing taxation. And we do have to be mindful for all the rhetoric that there is about the Conservatives having presided over austerity. Actually, the last Conservative government presided over the biggest increase in public spending since 1945. So there are significant constraints on the left. My view is that the Labour Party made a mistake, certainly so far as positioning themselves for government was concerned, in accepting all the Conservative tax cuts before the election. But whether or not the electorate will be willing to pay a great deal more, given that taxation is already relatively high, that's another matter. Because the room for increasing borrowing is probably quite limited, because the last thing you can afford is to precipitate a financial crash.